Our next speaker is a researcher, a teacher, an award-winning author. She teaches graduate students at the University of Houston. She studies how we love and how we build relationships. You're in for a real treat, Dr. Brene Brown.
I think the heart of my work is really about truth-telling and story. So I'm going to start there with a little truth-telling about me. A couple of weeks ago, my husband came into the kitchen and said, "How's the uptalk going?" And go back here. I shot him a look that is hauntingly familiar to husbands around the world, which conveyed, don't talk to me about the uptalk. And he said, "What's going on?" And I said, "I'm blocked. I can't do it." And he said, "You're never blocked." And I said, "Yeah, I know, I'm blocked." And he said, "Well, let's talk about what's the block." And I said, "I don't want to talk about it." And then I could see his eagerness, this moment to quote me back to me and say, "Isn't that when we should talk about it? When we don't want to talk about it?" So I said, "Yeah, okay, let me tell you. 5 years ago, I did a talk that was the biggest disaster maybe of my career. And I used my highly trained skills to be in denial about that talk for the last 5 years. And it had not crept back into my memory until I started preparing for today. And so I told him this story. 5 years ago, at that point, I'd already been studying my work for about 5 years. Very exciting time in my career. I just put a new theory into the academic literature. I just had a book come out, my first kind of book for normal people, not academic book. And I got my first invitation to speak to normal people. Not my colleagues, not mental health professionals, like normal people. So I was really excited. I wore my best clogs. I went, and it was a women's luncheon at a country club, and I was going to talk and sign books. So I get there, and I meet the event person, and she's waiting for me. And she said, "Oh, are you the researcher?" And I said, "I am." And she said, "What a pleasant surprise," which was either a compliment to me or like an insult to all researchers everywhere. And she said, "Did you bring your bio so I can, introduce you?" And I said, "Yeah." And she set it down, and she started reading it. And she got about 2 lines into it, and she goes, "Oh, God." And I said, "Is everything okay?" And she goes, "This says you study shame." And all of a sudden, I'm 8. And I'm like, "Yes, ma'am." And she said, "Shame?" And I said, "Yes, that's what I study." And she goes, "Do you study anything else?" Which, you have no idea how bad this is going to get. I said, "Yes, ma'am, fear and vulnerability." So she got really, I'll never forget what she looks like. Those things that are just forever in your conscious, anytime I see that St. John's suit, I crumble. She stood up very straight and she said, "I was told that you've interviewed thousands of people about how to be joyful and beautiful and happy. Is this true?" And I said, "No. I kind of study what gets in the way of being joyful and having meaningful lives, and I'm more of a study what gets in the way kind of person." And she said, and then she set her reading glasses down and did this. And you know how in poker there are tells? Well, clinicians, mental health professionals, we have tells too. The face rub is a total tell. I know that there's a translation for it. I don't know what it is, but suffice it to say it's along the lines of "Holy crap, say it ain't so." And she said, "If you'll excuse me." And she left, and then she came back, and she said, "Let me tell you how this is going to go today." And of course, I said, "Yes, ma'am." This is the difference between 30 and 40. 30s, you're like, "Yes, ma'am." 40s, you're like, "I'm getting my stuff." She said, "Number one, you're not going to talk about the things that get in the way. You're going to talk about how to, tips, helpful hints, how to, happier, joyful. Number 2, you can't use the word shame. People are eating." Yeah. Which was the first time I'd ever thought that my work actually could cause people to involuntarily throw up. This is true. Then she said, the third thing is, people want to be comfortable and happy. That's what people are looking for, comfort and happiness. And then she turned around and walked away. And just in case I didn't get it, the last thing she said to me in pantomime as well was, we want it to be light and breezy. Yeah. So I told Steve this story, and he said, oh my God, we never talked about this. I'm like, I know, because I stood there for an hour going, happy is important. Be happy. And he said, what are you going to do? And I was writing as we were talking, and I looked down and I said, I know exactly what I'm going to talk about it up. I know, it's been 10 years now. I've been doing this work for a decade, this research. And I am indeed a shame researcher. I study shame, belonging, and authenticity. And I thought for a long time that she was kind of a mean woman out to ruin my life. But what she said to me was symptomatic of the culture we live in. And I think what might be really tearing us apart individually in our families and our communities at work is this idea that we don't talk about the things that get in the way. We don't want to talk about the things that get in the way. What we want is how to. But let me tell you what my thoughts are about how to. Honestly, show of hands. If I gave you a little instrument, a little quiz about how to be smart with money, don't most of you know how to be kind of smart with money, with the kind of how to do that? We know how. If I gave you a survey or a quiz about how to eat healthy, you could answer it. There's no question. And the more you diet, the more you struggle with, the more you know all the answers. Most of us can look at a buffet on a ship and tell you how many points everything is on that buffet. We got how to down. So if how to was the issue, if all we needed to know is how to be joyful, how to have more meaning and purpose in our lives, we'd be done. But how to is not working because we are the most in debt, most obese, most addicted, and most medicated adult cohort in American history. How to, not working. The problem is bigger than how to. The problem is about what gets in the way of kind of implementing what we know. And I would argue from my work, it's the hustle for worthiness. We are all spending lots of time and energy chasing down worthiness. This idea of not talking about the things that get in the way is what's getting in the way. And what we need to talk about starts here. Hame, which is better than shame, I think. Because you don't have quite the visceral reaction to hame. Like if you said, I'm in deep hame, people would say, yeah, exactly. And I have to tell you, you have no idea the things I've heard of as a shame researcher. The first group I did where I was piloting a curriculum that I wrote, in group therapy, someone usually emerges as a leader, and the leader came up to me and said, we're struggling with this group, which was a shame resilience group. And I said, what is the struggle? And she said, we don't like the word shame. And I thought, well, what do you think we should do? And she said, we call it shame. Great, no. And for the next 5 weeks, we talked about the deep shame that we were trying to work through. So I'm okay with hame. So hame, fear, and vulnerability. So what I want to do is give you a window into shame and tell you a little bit about what shame is. Let me give you the quick 3 so you can breathe and pay attention to the next ones. We all have it. We're all afraid to talk about it. And the less we talk about it, the more we have it. Shame, we believe, is the most primitive human affect or emotion that we experience. We all have it. What we know from research about 3 or 4 decades now is the only people who don't experience shame have no capacity for human connection. If you don't experience shame, it's because you have no capacity for connection or empathy. And so what we're talking about there is kind of some serious psychopathology. So shame is something we all have. It drives two primary tapes, or kind of ways of thinking. The two big things that shame drives is never good enough and who do you think you are? And those are vices, let me tell you. Never good enough. You know, it's funny because if I said, how many of you wrestle with shame? No one would raise their hand. But if I said, how many of you struggle with perfectionism? That would be different, right? Would that feel different? Yeah, it would feel different. Shame, birthplace of perfectionism. Where we struggle with perfectionism, we struggle with shame. So this is a really universal thing for all of us. And it's really best easily understood as the fear of disconnection. There's something about me, there's something I've done or failed to do, you know, and it's in this culture where our self-worth is tied to our net worth, where everyone's houses are supposed to look like stills out of the Pottery Barn catalog. You know, how many of you received the fall Pottery Barn catalog? It's devastating to me. It is. I just want for one autumn, for all the pumpkin crap to be outside and to have my kids in slow motion in sweaters. That's just one time. You know, we have a media that tells us what we should look like, how much we should make, what we should weigh, how many times a week we should be having sex. We got the rules. And no one's doing it, but everyone's pretending. The issue around shame is it's an absolute silent epidemic. It's so funny because no one will talk about shame, but if you look at the Nielsen ratings for the last 5 years, the shows that really capture the top 10, shame-based programming, reality TV. I won't talk about what it felt like to be humiliated at work by my boss, but I'm sure as hell going to watch you get voted off the island at 8 o'clock. Because there's something about that feels kind of good. And it's because I have no one to talk to about the fact that I got totally put down in front of my colleagues today. Very quickly about men and women. There's some debate in the literature about if we experience shame differently. And so because I had some respect for that question, I interviewed separately. And again, I've collected thousands of stories over the last 10 years. I'm a qualitative interviewer. I do like long interviews with people. And here's the thing about shame and gender. When that warm wash of inadequacy washes over me, it doesn't feel any different than if it were to wash over my husband or Ernie or any other guy in here. The issue about shame and gender is this. The messages and expectations that fuel shame are absolutely gender-related. For women, shame is about not being perfect, not being everything to everyone, not being able to do it all and smile the whole time, not being thin and quiet and helpful. And for men, and there's a lot of, for women, let me go back, there's a lot of competing and conflicting expectations that make it very impossible for women to meet these expectations, especially without disappointing somebody. For men, there's not a lot of competing and conflicting expectations. There's one under which men, I would argue, are suffocating, and that is, do not be perceived as weak. Men have to be emotionally stoic. And it's funny because we set men up in the worst way, and I have to tell you, I had no interest in interviewing men at all. I really didn't want to know. And I always say it was an angry golfer, a small penis, and a wise feminist that made me do it. I was signing books at a book signing, and a woman came up and bought all these books, and her husband was with her, and he was about 60, you'll never forget, yellow Izod golf sweater. She walked away with her books, and he stood there at the table, and he said, I'll be right with you, to his wife. I'm going to ask her a question. And his wife looked at him and said, come on, babe. And he goes, I'm going to talk to her. And I could tell that I wanted him to go with her. And so I think I even did this. Like, dude, don't be rude. Go on. And he said, I really loved what you said about telling your story, being honest, reaching out, being vulnerable. The problem is that when men do that, we get the emotional shit beat out of us. I said, can I sign a book for you? I didn't know what to say, so I just kind of sat there. And he said, I was just getting ready to say something. He said, before you say anything about those mean dads and those coaches, let me tell you about women. My wife and daughters had rather me die on top of that white horse than watch me fall off. So I was like, oh, it was just, when truth hits you, you can't do much with it, but just kind of acknowledge it, and that's all I could do. So I fast forward a month, and I'm getting my sonogram. I'm pregnant. I have a 10-year-old daughter and a 4-year-old son, and I'm pregnant. And I was sure I was having a girl because kind of the OB led on early to that. And the technician asked my daughter, what do you want? She said, I want a brother. The technician said, it's your lucky day. And I said, oh, no, I'm having a girl. And she said, no, hon, you're not. And I said, no, I am. I make girls, like reviving Ophelia. I teach that. I know that. And he goes, this a boy, and look up on the screen. There's the little penis. And I was like, oh, my God, they can't be vulnerable. They die on the white horse. Oh, my, what do I do? And finally, the wise feminist was a friend of mine who we were staring at Charlie, my son, one day, and she said, here's the thing. When we do nothing for men and boys, we do nothing for girls and women. And I have to tell you that shame is shame. It doesn't pick a gender. And one of the worst setups I think for us in terms of male-female couples is this dynamic of, I feel shame as a woman, I feel like I'm not enough, and I kind of criticize and rage at you for not being enough, and your shame trigger for men, that constant criticism, that constant ridicule, that constant you're not enough, you're not doing enough, do more, make more, be more, is devastating, and we get into these horrible, vicious cycles. So the hard thing is that you can't get rid of shame. Again, the only people who don't experience it have no capacity for human emotion. But what can you do? We can be resilient. And across my interviews, what I found is that men and women with high levels of shame resilience have things in common. They understand shame. They know what triggers it. They absolutely talk about it. They use the word. And they tell their story. You want to know what courage is to me? What courage is to me is the ability to tell your story and like who you are in the process of doing that. And that's hard. Men and women who have high levels of shame resilience, what I found, and this is the work I've been doing for the last 3 years, have a tendency to have more authenticity. They live with a deeper sense of love and belonging, and they have a much more resilient spirit. And I think those are the things we're after. I think we want to feel comfortable in our own skin. I think we want a deep sense of love and belonging. I think it's a basic human need. And I'll tell you very quickly, if you were to ask me just from the data, what is the difference between people who have a deep sense of love and belonging and people who are struggling for it? The answer would be worthiness. That's the only difference. Men and women who carry a deep sense of love and belonging within them believe that they're worthy of love and belonging. The trick is no prerequisites. Not when I make partner, not when I lose 20 pounds, not if I get pregnant, not if my husband comes back, not if my daughter gets into Yale, not if I make the Fortune 500. No prerequisites. Just as is, right now, worthy of love and belonging. And the last thing is a resilient spirit. That is an absolute outcome of being able to live in your story. We get to rewrite the endings of our stories if we were willing to walk into them and own them. It's a powerful thing. Shame versus guilt, very quickly, and this is really important. A lot of people confuse these two. The difference between shame and guilt is the difference between I am bad and I did something bad. How many of you in the audience, if you made a mistake and hurt someone's feelings, how many of you would be willing to say, I'm sorry I made a mistake? Show of hands. How many of you, if you made that mistake, would be willing to say, I'm sorry, I am a mistake? That's the difference between shame and guilt. Here's what we know, 3 decades of research. Shame, highly correlated. Addiction, violence, depression, bullying, and eating disorders. Guilt, inversely correlated, meaning people who have a healthy sense of guilt, I'm not going to say, God, I'm so stupid. I'm going to say, wow, that was really stupid. Do great. They do much better on these indicators. The implications for this around parenting are huge. We can measure whether people are guilt-prone or shame-prone. And guess what the number one predictor variable is of whether you're going to be shame-prone or guilt-prone? Parenting style. As it turns out, there is a difference between, not just a linguistic difference, but a difference between you're a good kid and that was a bad choice, and you're a bad kid. The implications for this, and I do more and more corporate work, the implications for this in the corporate sector are huge. I interviewed a guy about a year ago who was in tears, a huge investment banker, who said it was their policy based on quarterly numbers, that if your numbers were the best, you got to box up your stuff and kick people out of any office that you wanted and take whatever office that you wanted. And he said it was more shaming to have to do that than to be kicked out. You know, it can become a management style. But dangerous. The outcomes are not good. Shame-prone versus guilt-prone kids, we measure them in 5th grade, again, as seniors in high school. Guilt-prone kids, more likely to apply for college, do well in high school, low drug use. Shame-prone kids, more likely to commit suicide, drop out of high school, engage in high-risk sexual behaviors, and heavier drug use. There's a difference. The last thing I want to say quickly is about comfort and joy. This whole idea of let's make the, my rules for that lecture that day, let's make the people happy and comfortable. You're going to have to choose between joyfulness and comfort. You can't choose between joy and comfort. The feeling of joy itself is a vulnerable, uncomfortable feeling. And so many of us have spent so much time numbing discomfort because we can't sit in it. I can tell you as a college professor, we're raising kids who have no tolerance for discomfort and disappointment. But the ability, you have to be able to feel discomfort in order to feel joy, because joy is as prickly as grief and shame. In addiction research, we see that an intensely joyful experience is as likely to cause relapse as an intensely negative experience. Joy can be uncomfortable because it's vulnerable. And to be honest with you, vulnerable is beauty. It's the vulnerable parts of us that make us beautiful. So I will just leave you with this. The things that get in the way are sometimes the only things that can set us free. And I would just invite you to find a way to talk about your story and someone, who loves you for your strengths and struggles, and be able to engage in these conversations and use the word HAME as much as possible. Thank you.
We've got a minute for me to ask a light and breezy question.
Sure. Light and breezy. Yeah, I can do light and breezy.
Actually, I was wondering if you could say just a little bit more on the relationship between shame and perfectionism.
Yeah. Not that I know it personally, but... So here's what perfectionism is. Here's a definition of perfectionism that'll help you understand. Perfectionism, not the same as healthy striving. Healthy striving is internally motivated, wanting to do the best you can. Perfectionism is simply a defense mechanism that leads this thought process. If I do it perfect, live perfect, look perfect, I can avoid or minimize feelings of shame, judgment, and blame. The thing about perfectionism that's so destructive and I think so addictive is you can't avoid or minimize feelings of judgment, shame, and blame. They're part of the human experience. So when you go out and you're not so perfect, which is not achievable, your thought process is, if I had just been more perfect, next time I'll be more perfect. And so really, if you think about perfectionism, not as healthy striving, but as a way to really protect ourselves from feeling less than.
Great. Thank you so much,
Thank
Brene.
you.